They thought it was just another fancy charity night until a billionaire publicly mocked a hotel maid and challenged her 12-year-old daughter to a $1 million poker bet, certain he would crush a child without effort. But what no one in that luxury ballroom expected was that the quiet girl carrying a tray was actually a brilliant strategist trained by her grandfather to read human behavior better than any professional player. As the entire crowd watched, what started as a cruel humiliation turned into a shocking turn of events that exposed the billionaire's ego, shattered his confidence, and revealed a level of intelligence in the young girl that left everyone speechless. By the end of the night, guests who came for glamour witnessed a lesson they would never forget. Underestimating the wrong person can cost more than money. It can cost your pride. Sophie arrived at the luxury hotel, feeling nervous but determined to help her mother. She knew her mother depended on this job, especially during important charity events. With a worker absent, Sophie had been asked to assist quietly, moving carefully through the elegant ballroom with a serving tray. She walked between tables of well-dressed guests, trying to remain invisible. The pressure of staying perfect, staying unnoticed, pressed down on her shoulders as she maneuvered around conversations and laughter. When she approached a table near the center of the room, someone bumped her from behind. Her wrist twisted. The drink slipped from the tray. Cold liquid splashed directly onto an expensive shoe. Sophie froze, heads turned. Her heart pounded as she tried to apologize, but words wouldn't come. The man looked down at his shoe, then at her with irritation. He raised his voice, drawing attention from nearby guests. Sophie recognized him from magazine covers. Mason Harding, the billionaire poker champion. His expression made clear he wasn't willing to let the moment pass quietly. He mocked her nervousness, made comments that caused people to laugh. Sophie's mother rushed over, apologizing repeatedly, but Mason continued the spectacle. More guests gathered, eager to see what would happen next. Then Mason, still irritated, leaned back in his chair and spoke loudly so everyone could hear. He brought up a poker challenge. His tone showed he didn't take it seriously, but wanted to humiliate Sophie further. He offered a shocking deal. If Sophie won, he would donate $1 million to charity under her name. If she lost, her mother would lose her job. Gasps spread through the room. Sophie's mother immediately refused, insisting the suggestion was unfair, but the crowd encouraged Sophie to accept. The excitement in the room made it hard to think clearly. Sophie felt anger rising, not just at Mason's mockery, but at the unfairness of it all. Something inside her refused to let him win this way. With a trembling voice, she accepted the challenge. Tables were moved aside. Chairs gathered around the poker area. Guests formed a circle, eager to witness the unusual showdown. Sophie sat across from Mason, feeling the tension in her stomach. Sophie placed her hands on the table, keeping them still so no one would see how nervous she really was. She tried not to look at Mason's confident posture. Instead, she focused on breathing slowly. As the professional dealer, David Chun, prepared the deck, Sophie found herself thinking about her grandfather. He had been a military analyst, someone who taught her that most people had habits they repeated without realizing it. Sophie never thought those lessons would matter in a moment like this, but now they were the only thing she felt confident about. She looked at Mason again, not as a celebrity, but as someone to study. She watched how he held his cards, how he sat, how he moved his hands. She paid attention to small changes in his expression. The crowd kept murmuring, but she tuned them out. Her grandfather always said patterns were easier to see when you ignored noise. As she observed, Sophie noticed something. When Mason seemed confident about his cards, he was almost too relaxed, shoulders steady, movements controlled, comfort in the chair. But when he seemed uncertain, everything about him became louder. He talked more, gestured more, tried too hard to appear confident. Sophie watched him carefully, comparing his behavior to what her grandfather had taught her. A strange sense of control began forming inside her. She still didn't understand every rule of poker, but she understood people. Right now, she needed every advantage she could get. When David dealt the cards, Sophie took a moment before looking at them. She lifted the corners carefully, and her heart jumped. 2 kings. Even she understood this was a very strong hand. She forced herself not to react. Then she looked at Mason. At first glance, He seemed too comfortable, almost pleased. Sophie recognized the relaxed posture from her observations. Mason must also have a strong hand. She understood that waiting would only give him more control. She needed to do something bold. Sophie placed her chips forward in one motion, all in, without hesitation. Gasps spread around the room. Mason's expression changed instantly. The relaxed confidence disappeared, replaced by irritation and confusion. He clearly hadn't expected a 12-year-old to make such an aggressive decision. Sophie kept her face still, remembering her grandfather's words about looking certain even when your hands are shaking. Mason eventually forced out an annoyed laugh, but she could see he was unsettled. Slowly, he pushed his chips forward to match her bet. David asked them to reveal their cards. Sophie showed her 2 kings first. The crowd reacted with surprise. Mason flipped his cards next. 2 aces. The room gasped again. Sophie was behind. She felt the weight of the situation, but kept her posture steady. David placed the first 3 community cards on the table. The ace of spades appeared first. The room erupted. Mason now had 3 aces. Sophie understood her chances had gone from small to almost impossible. Sophie watched Mason closely. He grinned widely, tapped his fingers rapidly on the table, made dramatic gestures. But something was wrong with his behavior. When he had a strong hand earlier, he stayed relaxed and controlled. Now he was exaggerated, almost too excited. Sophie felt something shift in her mind. Strong hands bring calm. Weak ones bring noise, unless something else is influencing the reaction. She realized there was a contradiction in Mason's behavior. His celebration didn't come from strategy. It came from ego. He was desperate to prove something to everyone watching. Sophie straightened her posture. She looked directly at Mason, studying every detail of his exaggerated performance. The more she studied him, the more certain she became. He was bluffing about something much more important than the cards themselves. As Mason continued celebrating, Sophie finally spoke. Her voice was calm but firm enough to cut through the noise. She told Mason his reactions didn't make sense. She pointed out that someone with such a strong hand shouldn't be acting the way he was. She said he was bluffing about his willingness to follow through on the employment bet. His behavior showed insecurity, not confidence. She said someone as famous as he was wouldn't risk so much over a simple accident. The crowd grew silent, confused at first. Sophie didn't flinch. She had no control over the cards, but she had control over what she chose to say. She had chosen to confront him, using everything she understood about patterns and truth. Sophie kept her eyes on Mason, but now her focus was on the deal itself. She spoke clearly so everyone could hear. She said the entire bet made no sense because Mason didn't have the power to fire her mother in the first place. The crowd grew quieter as they processed her words. Sophie turned toward Mr. Harrison, the hotel's owner. She asked him directly if Mason had authority to dismiss any employee. Mr. Harrison, looking surprised at being called out, answered honestly. Only management could make decisions about staff. Mason had no right. The crowd reacted with murmurs of disagreement. Sophie felt a wave of relief. She had spoken the truth and people were listening. David Chun stepped forward and spoke firmly. A poker bet could not involve someone's employment, especially when the person making the bet had no authority over it. Because of that, the part of the wager about her mother's job was invalid. Only the chips on the table counted. Mason clenched his jaw, visibly angry at being corrected in front of so many people. Sophie watched him carefully. He was trying to rush the situation to protect his image. She agreed to continue the match, not because she expected to win, but because she had already taken back what mattered most: her mother's job. The guests shifted around the table, trying to get a better view. No one was cheering anymore. Instead, they watched with curiosity and judgment. David prepared to reveal the turn card. The room fell silent. When he placed the card on the table, the guests reacted instantly. It was the king of clubs. Sophie now had 3 kings. Her heart jumped, but she kept her expression flat. Mason stared at the king as if it were a personal insult. His expression tightened. His confident smile faded. Sophie observed him carefully. His earlier celebration stopped abruptly. He shifted in his chair, tapping his fingers faster than before. His behavior no longer matched someone in control. He looked irritated and unsure. Sophie remained still. She did not want to give him any information through her body language. She simply watched, calm on the outside, focused on the inside. Her mother stood nearby, looking worried but also proud. The balance of confidence had shifted. The atmosphere among the guests was completely different now. Many of them no longer viewed Mason as a confident champion, but as someone losing control. David prepared to reveal the final card. The entire room seemed to freeze as everyone leaned in with anticipation. Sophie forced herself to breathe slowly. She knew she was still behind, even with 3 kings, and only one card could change the result. When David finally turned the river card, the room reacted with shock. It was the King of Diamonds. Sophie felt her chest tighten. She now had 4 kings. She did not smile, move, or speak. She just stared at the cards, almost unable to believe it. Mason blinked several times as if his eyes were playing a trick on him. The guests looked between them in complete silence, trying to understand the impossible turn of events. No one cheered or celebrated. They were too stunned to react. Mason finally stood up, his chair pushing back sharply, his face twisted with disbelief and anger. He looked at the cards again, as if hoping they would change. Sophie kept her gaze down, waiting. Mason turned toward David with a furious expression. He shouted that the game had been rigged. He accused the dealer of cheating. His voice echoed across the room. Before the dealer could respond, Mason reached for the chips in frustration. 2 security guards moved quickly toward him. They stopped him by holding his arms, preventing him from causing any more trouble. Mason struggled against them, still shouting that the match was unfair. His voice grew louder and less controlled. The guests watched in disbelief. Sophie felt uneasy, but she also understood the situation was no longer about her. Mason was reacting to his own loss, unable to accept the truth. Security tried to guide him toward the exit, but he pulled against their grip. He continued yelling, claiming the hotel would face a lawsuit. He threatened the staff, the management, and the guests. His anger grew more chaotic with each sentence. The same people who had cheered for him earlier now avoided his eyes. Finally, one of the most respected guests, Frank Johnson, stepped forward. His voice carried weight as he spoke clearly, saying that Mason had been defeated in a fair game and everyone had seen the results with their own eyes. The guards continued moving Mason toward the exit. The crowd stepped aside to make a path. Security escorted him through the doors until he disappeared from view. The room fell into complete stillness. The bright lights, the elegant decorations, the entire atmosphere that once felt energetic now felt strangely heavy. Sophie remained seated for a moment. Then her mother rushed forward, moving through the rows of guests who stepped aside to let her pass. She reached Sophie and wrapped her arms around her, filled with relief, fear, and pride all at once. Susan held her daughter for several seconds before pulling back just enough to look her in the eyes. The guests around them watched the emotional moment. Some placed hands over their mouths, others blinked rapidly, as if holding back tears themselves. Sophie rested her forehead against her mother's shoulder. The room felt warmer now, even though no one had spoken yet. Then, unexpectedly, someone began clapping. It was a soft sound at first, but then another person joined, then another. Soon the entire room filled with applause. The tension that had built throughout the night slowly faded. Sophie straightened slightly, surprised by the sudden support. When the applause softened enough for her to speak, she announced she did not want the prize. She asked for all the chips to be donated fully to the charity event. The crowd reacted with shock, then admiration. The applause returned, louder this time, but filled with respect rather than excitement. Even those who had doubted her earlier now admired her sincerity. Mr. Harrison stepped forward with a thoughtful expression. He asked if Sophie and her mother would follow him to his office for a private conversation. In his office, Mr. Harrison spoke with genuine regret. He apologized directly to Susan for allowing Mason to behave so poorly. He admitted he should have stepped in earlier, instead of watching things escalate. He told Susan he had failed as a leader by not protecting his staff. Then he turned to Sophie. He asked her how she had found the courage to confront Mason even before the cards were fully revealed. Sophie paused and then explained. She said she didn't act out of confidence in winning the game. She acted because she understood patterns. Her grandfather had taught her that people reveal their intentions through how they sit, how they react, and how they try to appear to others. She told Mr. Harrison that Mason had shown his pattern early. When he had a strong hand, he stayed relaxed. When he wanted to seem stronger than he really was, he acted louder. Understanding that helped her make decisions even when she felt afraid. Sophie explained that she noticed Mason's behavior change at several moments. His arrogance made him careless. Because he wanted attention, he pushed too hard. Standing up to him was not easy, but once she recognized the weakness behind his attitude, she felt she had to speak the truth. Mr. Harrison listened closely, clearly impressed. He told her that most adults, even ones with years of experience, failed to recognize patterns the way she did. He said her ability to stay focused under pressure and her willingness to understand people instead of reacting to them made her stand out. He expressed his admiration, explaining that Emily had shown maturity far beyond her age. Then he announced something life-changing. He promised that the hotel would take care of all past and current medical debts. Then he established a full scholarship fund in her name. The scholarship would cover tuition, books, and all academic expenses at any university she chose in the future. Sophie stood quietly, overwhelmed but grateful, understanding that her life had changed in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. Sophie and her mother stepped into the elevator together. Both were trying to understand the weight of everything that had happened. Susan held Sophie's hand firmly, afraid something might slip away if she let go. When the elevator reached the lobby floor, the ballroom looked different. The music had been turned off. The bright lights felt less glamorous. Guests stood in small groups, speaking quietly, as if something sacred had occurred. People parted for them without being asked. Some placed hands over their hearts, others nodded deeply. Their eyes carried admiration rather than curiosity or judgment. Sophie noticed the change, but she kept her gaze forward. She was no longer overwhelmed. She was simply tired, emotionally and physically. They walked through the hallway leading to the service area. Here the guests' presence faded behind them. The luxurious decorations became less noticeable. The polished shine of the floor gave way to the familiar hallway leading to the employees' wing. Sophie and her mother descended the narrow stairs that led back to their small apartment. The atmosphere changed completely. The bright lights, polished marble, and expensive decorations were replaced by plain walls and the steady hum of everyday work. When they reached their modest apartment, the contrast with the luxury ballroom became even more obvious. Emily walked slowly toward the small wooden table beside the worn couch. There, placed in a simple frame, was the photograph of her grandfather. She picked it up gently and held it close, studying the familiar face that had always made her feel safe. Susan watched her from the doorway, her heart tightening with emotion. Susan walked toward her daughter and wrapped her arms around her from behind. She didn't try to hide her tears anymore. The events of the night, the fear, the relief, and the pride all came rushing back at once. Susan held Sophie tightly and whispered that her grandfather would be incredibly proud of her. Her voice shook as she spoke. She remembered how he used to say that Sophie had a unique way of seeing the world, even when she was much younger. Sophie listened quietly and then looked at the photograph again. With calm certainty, she answered that her grandfather already knew. There was no hesitation in her voice. She spoke with a kind of confidence that had grown stronger throughout the night. Susan pulled back slightly so she could look at her daughter's face. Wiping her eyes, Susan mentioned how lucky Sophie had been with the cards. But Sophie shook her head gently. She explained that the victory hadn't come from the kings she received. Those cards helped, but they weren't the reason she won. She turned toward her mother and spoke clearly. She said the real win happened earlier, long before the king appeared on the table. It happened when she recognized how Mason reacted to pressure, how he tried to look stronger than he was, and how his ego controlled his decisions. Sophie said the match was not about luck. It was about seeing what Mason couldn't hide. Once she understood his weakness, she knew exactly how he would react, even when the game seemed stacked against her. Susan felt a deep warmth in her chest as she listened to her daughter explain everything with such clarity. She touched Sophie's cheek gently, both proud and amazed. Sophie set the photo back on the table. She said that the real match had ended the moment she understood Mason's weakness, not when the river card revealed the king. The room felt calm, peaceful, and honest. The chaos of the ballroom was far behind them. Inside their small apartment, there was no applause, no tension, and no pressure, only the truth of what Sophie had achieved. Together, they stood in the soft, quiet light of their home, knowing that the night had changed them both forever. The fame, the admiration, the scholarships, these were wonderful. But what mattered most was this moment, this truth. This bond between a mother and her daughter, stronger than any billionaire's pride, more valuable than any amount of money. As they held each other in their simple home, the world outside seemed far away and unimportant. What remained was the quiet truth shared between them. An ending shaped by courage, understanding, and a bond that had proven stronger than anything they had faced. The story closed not with noise, but with a calm that belonged only to them.